Janice Harper was 8 months pregnant. She eagerly awaited the arrival of her first child, carefully picking out baby clothes, decorating the nursery, and reading books about motherhood. Everything seemed to be going well. Her previous doctor visits were routine, and no one noticed anything unusual. But one evening, her peaceful life suddenly changed. That day, Janice returned home after a long day teaching elementary school. She felt a faint but uncomfortable pain in her lower abdomen. At first, she thought it was just exhaustion after work. But by nightfall, the pain had worsened. Her legs began to swell, and a pounding headache wouldn't go away. "Mark," she called to her husband, trying to keep her voice calm so as not to alarm him. "Something's wrong. I don't feel right." Mark, an engineer who was usually calm and rational, immediately tensed up. He noticed how pale Janice's face had become and saw her trembling hands. He helped her get out of bed and quickly grabbed the car keys. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly, leaving no room for discussion. At the local hospital, they were greeted by a tired receptionist. She lazily wrote down Janice's name and gestured toward the waiting area. The pain had become almost unbearable, but Janice tried to stay composed to avoid appearing too emotional, a lesson she had learned after years of living in a predominantly white neighborhood. Sitting in the corner of the waiting room, she noticed how other patients, all white, were being seen much faster, even when their symptoms seemed less severe. She caught their glances, some filled with pity, others with outright curiosity. But no one offered help. After 40 minutes, she was finally called into the examination room. The pain had worsened, and she could barely stand. Mark helped her to the door, but he wasn't allowed inside. Inside, she was greeted by Dr. Wilson, an older white man with a weary expression. He didn't even look up when she entered. He asked a few formal questions, showing little interest. "I'm experiencing severe abdominal pain, my legs are swelling, and I have a terrible headache," Janice said, struggling to get the words out. "I'm worried it might be something serious, maybe preeclampsia." Dr. Wilson glanced at her with a slight smile, as if she had said something ridiculous. "Preeclampsia? Did you read about that online? Trust me, I've seen hundreds of pregnant women, and they all complain about pain. It's normal. But doctor, my mother had this condition before I was born. It could be hereditary," Janice tried to explain. "I know what I'm doing," Wilson interrupted sharply, not even glancing at her medical chart. "Rest, drink more water, and it will pass. If it gets worse, come back." When Janice returned to the waiting area, her eyes were filled with tears. Mark immediately approached her. "What did he say?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "He said it's fine. Just fatigue," Janice replied quietly, but doubt was evident in her voice. "Fine? You can barely stand." Mark couldn't hide his anger. He saw other patients, clearly with less severe symptoms, leaving the doctor's office with prescriptions and detailed treatment plans. "They just don't want to deal with you." Janice remained silent. She felt the same injustice but was afraid to say it out loud. She knew that arguing could make things worse. She had been taught to endure, suppress her emotions, and always be polite to avoid being labeled as the loud and angry black woman. "Let's go home," Mark said, squeezing her hand. "But if it gets worse in a few hours, we're coming back, and I'll make sure they listen to you." That night, Janice lay in bed, feeling the pain grow stronger. She couldn't sleep, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She felt helpless and invisible, but above all, she worried about her child. What if something happens to the baby? And I didn't do enough, she thought, her heart tightening with fear. In the next room, Mark sat in front of his laptop, researching symptoms of preeclampsia. The more he read, the more convinced he became that Dr. Wilson had made a grave mistake. But what could they do? The hospital was the only one in their area and in their town. Doctors with this kind of attitude were more the rule than the exception. "We have to fight," Mark whispered to himself, closing the laptop. "I won't let them leave her without help." The night was unbearable. The pain in Janice's abdomen became so intense that she couldn't sleep. Her head throbbed, her blood pressure felt like it was skyrocketing, and her breathing became uneven. She knew something was seriously wrong, and that ignoring the symptoms could lead to tragedy. "Mark," she whispered, barely holding back tears, "we need to go to the hospital." Her husband, who hadn't slept at all, jumped up immediately. He already knew they would return, and this time, he wouldn't stop until she received the care she needed. When they arrived at the hospital early in the morning, The atmosphere was completely different. The waiting room was more crowded than the night before, and the same receptionist from yesterday looked at them with irritation upon hearing the name Harper. "You were here yesterday," she said, glancing at her monitor. "Are you complaining about the same thing again?" Mark held back his frustration, though it took effort. "Yes, we're here again. My wife is in severe pain, and I want her to be seen immediately." The woman sighed and gestured toward the waiting area. "Wait your turn." Despite Mark's protests, they ended up waiting for over an hour. During this time, Janice's condition worsened. Her face turned red, she complained of dizziness and difficulty breathing. She fainted several times, only to regain consciousness as Mark frantically called out to the medical staff. When a nurse finally approached them, she gave Janice only a cursory glance. "You should have come sooner if her condition was this bad," she said with a tone of reproach. "We did come sooner," Mark snapped. "Are you still going to dismiss this as normal pregnancy pain? Look at her. She can barely breathe." The nurse reluctantly led them into a small examination room. Once there, they were left alone again. Mark watched as other patients, white patients, walked past their door. Many of them appeared far less sick, yet they were receiving more attention and care. "This is disgraceful," he whispered, holding Janice's hand. "To them, we're invisible." After half an hour of waiting, a different nurse entered the room. She began asking routine questions, but froze when she saw Janice's blood pressure readings. "Her blood pressure is dangerously high. We're sending her for an ultrasound immediately," the nurse said. Janice was too weak to respond, but Mark finally felt a sense of urgency from the staff. "Why didn't you do this earlier? Why did you let her sit there and suffer?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger. The nurse didn't answer and hurried out of the room. Moments later, another figure entered. Dr. Lawrence, a middle-aged black woman, who immediately went to Janice. Dr. Lawrence carefully examined Janice and reviewed her medical chart. Her expression became serious as she looked over the previous test results. "Why weren't you admitted yesterday? All the symptoms point to preeclampsia. This is extremely dangerous," she said, addressing both Janice and Mark. "Dr. Wilson said it was just normal pregnancy pain," Janice replied softly. Dr. Lawrence pressed her lips together, clearly trying to suppress her frustration. "You need to be admitted immediately. This condition puts both your life and your baby's life at risk." Janice was rushed to the intensive care unit. Dr. Lawrence quickly organized a series of tests and procedures. The ultrasound confirmed that the baby was suffering from oxygen deprivation, and it was decided that an emergency C-section was necessary. Mark waited outside the operating room, his heart heavy with worry. Why did it take so long? Why did they let her reach this point before taking action, he thought, clenching his fists. Hours later, the surgery was completed. The baby was born, a boy, but he was in critical condition. Janice was also placed in intensive care, her life still hanging by a thread. Mark felt powerless, but resolved to fight for her, for their son, and for justice. After the emergency surgery led by Dr. Lawrence, Janice was transferred to the intensive care unit. Her baby boy, weighing just over 2 kilograms, was placed in the neonatal intensive care unit due to low birth weight. He was diagnosed with hypoxia, a lack of oxygen caused by the delayed medical intervention. Doctors warned Mark that there could be serious long-term consequences, such as developmental or neurological complications. Mark sat in the corridor, holding a small stuffed toy that Janice had bought for the baby in her second month of pregnancy. He stared at the closed doors of his wife's room, replaying the events of the past 2 days in his mind. Why didn't they listen to us? Why did it take a near tragedy for someone to finally pay attention? He thought, struggling to hold back tears. He already knew he wouldn't let this situation go unanswered. A few hours later, Dr. Lawrence approached him. Her face conveyed professional seriousness, but her eyes showed genuine compassion. "Your wife is stable," she said. "We managed to stop the bleeding and stabilize her blood pressure. She needs plenty of rest, but I'm confident she'll recover. Your son is still under observation, but his condition is improving." Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him, but anger still simmered beneath the surface. "Dr. Lawrence, Why was her condition ignored yesterday? We came here twice, and both times they sent her home. Dr. Haley tried to calm him. We will conduct an internal investigation to understand what happened and take any necessary actions. But Mark wasn't satisfied. Your internal investigations won't change anything. This isn't the first time patients like my wife, Black patients, have been ignored here. We're going to demand justice. Mark decided to take their story to the media. He shared Janice's experience with local journalists, and soon an article titled "Systemic Discrimination: How Medical Bias Endangers Lives" was published in a local newspaper. The story struck a chord with many readers, and people began sharing their own experiences of discrimination in healthcare. Activists advocating for racial equality in medicine quickly took notice. They organized a protest outside the hospital, demanding transparency and accountability. Protesters held signs that read, "Healthcare for all, not just for some. Health has no color. Justice for Janice and Elijah." The movement gained momentum, drawing national attention. Janice's story became a symbol of a broader issue that many Black patients faced within the healthcare system. A week after the public outcry, the hospital was forced to issue an official statement. Dr. Wilson, who had twice dismissed Janice's symptoms, was suspended from his position. The chief physician announced the creation of a task force to review the hospital's patient care protocols. Moreover, the hospital promised to implement several changes, including mandatory cultural competency training for all staff, establishing a patient advocacy committee to prevent similar situations, conducting an independent audit to identify systemic issues. Dr. Wilson ultimately lost his medical license, and other staff members who ignored Janice's condition faced disciplinary actions. 2 weeks after the surgery, Janice was finally able to hold her baby boy. Tears streamed down her face as she cradled his tiny body. "You're our little hero," she whispered to him. Mark stood beside her, watching his wife and son with pride. Despite the pain and challenges, they had survived this crisis. But he knew their fight for justice wasn't over. Their story had already begun to change lives, and they were determined to push for systemic reforms in healthcare. Janice and Mark's story reached its emotional peak, but it was far from over. Their battle for justice inspired others, shedding light on the systemic issues within healthcare. They had taken the first steps toward change, and for Janice and Mark, this was only the beginning of their mission to ensure no one else would have to face what they endured. Weeks had passed since the tragic events at the hospital. Janice was slowly recovering at home, surrounded by the love and support of Mark. Her body was still healing from the surgery, but her heart was filled with gratitude that she and her son had survived. Every evening, she spent hours holding her baby boy, whom they had named Elijah, meaning, "My God is salvation." Mark stood by her side, while also focusing on their case against the hospital. He was determined to ensure that what happened to their family would never happen to anyone else. Mark found a lawyer specializing in medical malpractice and discrimination. Together, they filed a lawsuit against the hospital, accusing it of systemic bias and negligence that had nearly cost Janice and her baby their lives. During the investigation, shocking details came to light. Complaints about Dr. Wilson had been made before. Several other patients, mostly Black, had reported that their symptoms were dismissed or downplayed. An independent report revealed that the hospital lacked cultural competency training for its staff, which often led to biased treatment. The lawsuit soon gained traction, and Janice and Mark became the face of a growing movement for equal treatment in healthcare. Their story was widely covered in the media. As the trial unfolded, protests outside the hospital intensified. Activists, patients, and supporters gathered to show solidarity with the Harper family. Protesters held signs with powerful messages: "Healthcare shouldn't discriminate," "Justice for Janice and Elijah," "End medical racism now." The movement quickly spread beyond their town, drawing attention on a national level. Janice's story resonated with many people who had experienced similar biases in the healthcare system. After weeks of hearings and numerous testimonies, the court ruled in favor of the Harper family. The hospital was ordered to pay substantial compensation for the physical and emotional trauma Janice had endured. Additionally, the court mandated sweeping reforms at the hospital, mandatory cultural competency training for all staff, establishing a patient advocacy board to monitor care and ensure accountability, conducting independent audits to identify and address systemic issues. Dr. Wilson lost his medical license, and other staff members who had ignored Janice's condition faced disciplinary action. After the trial, life for the Harper family began to return to normal. Janice, finally free from the fear that had plagued her, was able to embrace motherhood fully. She decided to use her experience to help others. Advocacy and education. Janice began speaking at conferences and community events, sharing her story to highlight the urgent need for equal access to medical care. A legacy of hope. Together with Mark, she founded the Elijah Foundation, named after their son. The foundation aimed to provide resources and support to Black women seeking quality health care. Mark also continued to advocate for systemic change, using his platform to push for national reforms in the healthcare system. The Harper family's case became a catalyst for national conversations about racial disparities in healthcare. Their story spurred the introduction of new policies aimed at combating discrimination. Hospitals across the country began implementing training programs and strengthening oversight to protect patients from bias. One day, Janice received a letter from a woman who wrote about how Janice's story had inspired her to insist on a more thorough medical examination, which ultimately saved her and her baby's lives. As Janice read the letter, tears filled her eyes, and she realized their fight had not been in vain. 2 years had passed since Janice and Elijah had nearly lost their lives. One evening, the Harper family sat in the garden of their home. Elijah, now a healthy and energetic toddler, ran around laughing. Janice and Mark watched him with love and pride. "Do you think we've done enough?" Janice asked, holding Mark's hand. "No," Mark replied with a smile, "but we've started." Their story became a beacon of hope, proving that one family's determination could challenge injustice and ignite change, paving the way for a more equitable future.